Hello, my name is Kelly Tebow, and I'm with the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders. I will be your organizer for this evening and would like to welcome you to our webinar on Insight into the Anxious Learner, Research and Intervention. Thank you all for joining us. Before I have my colleague introduce the speaker for tonight, I'm going to cover some housekeeping items with you. All participants are muted. If you have a question, please type it in the bottom of your question box and click send. You may send questions during the webinar. However, we will have Dr. Murphy answer the questions at the end of her presentation. We will get to as many queries as time allows. In addition, tonight's presenter is available to take your questions on the Wednesday webinar blog, which is accessed from our homepage under the heading Programs. This blog will be monitored for the next 7 days. Feel free to look and post questions as often as you like. Answers will be archived for future reference. If you missed part of the presentation or would like to watch it again, an archived version will be posted to our website. We value your input, and in order to expand the webinar experience in the future, we need everyone listening to fill out the survey when you exit the webinar. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any other physician, nor do we advocate for any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now, I'm going to turn over the introduction of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the webinar coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Kelly, thanks, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Hilary Murphy. This is Dr. Murphy's second webinar with us, and she is back by popular demand. For her first webinar in January of this year, she covered exploring and managing the impact of ADHD across the lifespan. This webinar is available for free download on our website, and I encourage everyone to check it out. Dr. Murphy received her Ph.D. in clinical psychology with a concentration in pediatric neuropsychology from Fordham University in New York. Her specialty is in neuropsychological assessment of neurodevelopmental and neuromedical disorders. Dr. Murphy, a certified school psychologist, has extensive experience evaluating children, adolescents, and young adults. As part of her training, she participated in interdisciplinary treatment teams in both an inpatient and outpatient context, treating clients presenting with a variety of neurological, neurodevelopmental, and psychological needs. Her training as a school psychologist provides her with expertise in collaborating and consulting with educators and other professionals to develop comprehensive, individualized education and treatment plans. She adopts a multifaceted approach to neuropsychological assessment, which takes an individual's culture, social emotional functioning, cognitive profile, and academic performance into account to be able to develop a holistic understanding of each patient's unique presentation. Dr. Murphy, welcome back. And now, without further introduction, I'm pleased to turn tonight's presentation over to you.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here and to be able to present to all of you, and I appreciate all of you giving me your time tonight. Now, one of the things that I think is most important about understanding anxiety, particularly in learning, is that we know that there is such a high and strong impact of any kind of emotional stress on our general cognitive functioning. So one of the things that I really want to address tonight is I want to talk about what I mean by anxiety. We're going to talk a little bit about theory, and I promise not to get too dry, not too into the weeds for anybody. I also want to talk about our definition of a specific learning disability. And one of the reasons that I like to do that is to really elucidate what are the kind of learning issues that we're referencing when we're talking about this kind of population, especially because we know that there is a very particular emotional presentation that is unique to children who have documented learning issues. And finally, I want to tie it all together and really talk about what does the research really say about the relationship between anxiety and learning? Because we originally kept thinking that it was something that was incredibly negative, but really more recent research is showing us that there's a more nuanced view of the relationship between these two variables, and that in some instances, anxiety can actually be something that really improves our ability to do well. So let's just start off by talking about what a learning disability is. Now, as a clinical neuropsychologist and as someone who's worked as a school psychologist as well, this is something that I see very, very frequently. And the reason I wanted to focus on it at the top of this presentation is because it is one of the largest educational classifications that we see in the educational system. So I want to talk about the three main domains that we will see issues in. Those include, obviously, reading, written expression, and mathematics. And we have different designations to try to parse out where exactly the dysfunction is occurring. Now, one of the things that we know about these children is not only do they have weaknesses in their learning, but there is this very particular emotional presentation that tends to come along with these kinds of issues. So what I'm talking about here is that usually these children will start to struggle as they compare themselves to their peers. We know that children develop the ability to make comparisons between their skills and the skills of those around them around age 6. So individuals who start showing these early learning weaknesses are also developing the capacity at a very early age to see that they're being outpaced by other people. And that can cause a tremendous amount of anxiety just in and of itself. And if we think about how complex of an emotion anxiety is, it's not surprising to think that these children can very easily become overwhelmed by that kind of feeling and can have a lot of difficulty expressing what exactly it is. When we look at the statistics, we see that it's something that's very, very common in this population. And so I think it's important just to make clear at the front that these are two things that have been well connected in the research, both educationally, psychologically, for quite a long time. Now, the other thing that I really like to talk about here also is a nonverbal learning disability. And while this term, this phrase, is not a formal diagnostic label at this time, it's something that does come up because we know that this constellation of symptoms, which include things such as weaknesses in math, mild social issues, difficulties in aspects of attention and executive functioning, as well as difficulties with navigation and other visual spatial tasks. We know that it's something that often presents alongside other kinds of learning issues. And just like what we talked about a moment ago with some of these other specific learning disabilities, it also carries a very particular emotional signature, if you will, particularly with respect to anxiety. And so while this is not a formal term, I think it's also something that's good to talk about because as a neuropsychologist, it's something that I will often review with parents. Now, one of the things that often comes up with this particular label is whether or not it's synonymous with something like autism spectrum disorder or Asperger's, what we used to refer to as Asperger's. It is not the same thing. This constellation, again, is something that's more subtle, and there's far more variability in this population. The difficulties in social functioning that we can sometimes see with these children is very unique in that it's not a deficit in social knowledge, but rather is a difficulty in integrating all of these different pragmatic skills. So the social use of our language, reading nonverbal cues, listening to sarcasm and our tone or prosody, integrating all of those things to produce these really complex behaviors that we use to navigate social situations. Now, when we try to make initially the connection between anxiety and learning issues, one of the things that's important is that we know that ongoing school difficulties, just having weaknesses at the most base level, that contributes to a very high rate of anxiety for any child. I mentioned a little while ago that if we imagine a young child who is struggling to read, let's just focus on reading because I think it's one of the most common concerns that will come into my office when I'm considering a learning disability. Children become highly aware of the fact that it's much easier for their peers to sound out these terms, that perhaps they're reading at a much slower rate or they're making more mistakes. And we know that just in and of itself, that can cause anxiety. But let's imagine if then the child next to you starts to laugh when you mispronounce a word. That's going to heighten your anxiety. This is something that I can relate to personally because as a child growing up, I struggled tremendously in math. And it wasn't until I had reached college that any of my professors had talked about the idea that perhaps I had a learning disability through school. Now, it was interesting because I have one very vivid memory where I was called up to the board to complete a problem, which I don't know if any of you can relate to this, but it was probably one of the most frightening experiences that an 8-year-old can face, being called up to the front of the class, having to stand there, chalk in hand, staring at the problem, and truly having no idea what I was supposed to do. And not only did I know I had no idea, my teacher knew, and then every single person in my class knew. And the combination of those variables made me avoid math in any way, shape, or form for the rest of my life. To this day, I get a little bit of a cold sweat if I've got to do some mental math and I don't have a calculator in hand. And it sounds a little glib, but if you think about it, that's something that stayed with me. It made such a mental imprint that I can remember that day. I can almost feel the chalk in my hand staring up at those numbers. So we know that now we're starting to see where this relationship can go. And if we're going to avoid something, well, that pattern of behavior has a particular impact on learning as well, that we're going to talk about as we move forward in the presentation. Now, just at baseline, we know that these children, again, start to make comparisons between themselves and those around them. They start to feel as though their self-worth, their self-efficacy, or their competence is far lower than that of their peers, because if they're not provided with the appropriate supports, they do start to fall behind. Despite being capable, despite being, hardworking, despite all of these other things, it's essentially trying to run a marathon with, one leg in a cinder block. You're always going to be behind because you're always pulling that extra weight. It's always more effortful for you. Now, one of the things that is also important here, and it's something that I talk a lot about with families, is whether or not to discuss with a child that they have a learning disability. And a lot of parents are really afraid to stigmatize the child and make them feel uncomfortable. But one of the things that I often will say to parents is that the children that you're talking about, they're already aware. Kids know when they're struggling. Kids know when something is difficult. And many times giving them that extra support of, this is what this is. This is called dyslexia. And it doesn't mean you're stupid. It doesn't mean that you're slow. It doesn't mean anything other than the fact that you learn a different way. And there is a particular technique we should use to teach you to help you understand how to read, to help you be successful in other domains. That then takes the burden off the child, and it creates almost a separate entity that they can kind of project some of the anxiety on. It's not me. It's the fact that I have dyslexia. It's not that I'm stupid or I'm lazy or I'm not motivated. It's because I have dyslexia. And that can be very liberating for a child who's been shouldering that burden for a long time. Now, when we think about some of the relationships with teachers, particularly for younger children, this is very important too, because if we think about the basic building blocks of our perspectives on school, our relationship with school, and later on our relationship with learning, what we know is that for young children in particular, they tend to develop a much more negative view of their teachers. Now, this is not a reflection on the efficacy of the teacher, or the quality, or any other thing that's related to the teacher or the kind of method or the pedagogy that's used. Rather, what we're seeing is that for many of these children, their reactions, their relationships with the teachers are tinged with the fact that this is something that's already difficult for them at baseline. They're usually having to be singled out by teachers for extra help. Or perhaps the teacher is always calling on them, or doesn't realize that the child isn't being disruptive because they're being oppositional. They're being disruptive because they want to try to get out of class. It is very easy to see any teacher, whether well-meaning or not, helping to sometimes contribute unknowingly to this cycle. So many times the children will develop this sense of frustration that's expressed in the middle of the classroom. They don't want to interact with their teachers. Again, they may try to be disruptive to get out of class. And a lot of times they may be disciplined more often. So you can see how this relationship slowly starts to grow, particularly in a child who isn't able to fully express or understand, well, I'm doing this because it's hard for me to read right now. If I had been standing in the front of that blackboard holding the chalk in hand and I had thrown the chalk down and tried to run out of class, my teacher would have had a very different reaction to me than what I actually did, which was stand there, fiddle with the chalk, and eventually ask if someone else could solve the problem. But again, we see all of these other social emotional factors that are coming in that can contribute to a child's negative view of learning. Now, let's talk about some of the theories that underlie the relationship purely between learning disabilities and anxiety. There are a couple that are worth talking about. Now, the first is called the secondary reaction, and essentially what this says is that anxiety manifests secondary to a deficit in learning, so that the deficit in learning is occurring first, and because our learning is below that of our peers, we start to experience anxiety. The next theory is a primary disorder. This is essentially the opposite, saying that learning deficits come from elevated anxiety. So it's the anxiety that interferes with the efficiency of our learning and our ability to perform. And then finally, we have the cerebral dysfunction theory, which essentially says that both learning disabilities and anxiety are organic in nature. That means that they occur at the brain level, and they share the same brain-based pathology. Essentially, there's something wrong with the wiring of the brain that causes both the anxiety and the learning disability at the same time. Now, it's important to say that the reason that we have a lot of these theories is because learning disabilities and anxiety, the relationship between these two variables was initially noted as early as the early 1900s, when the concept of a specific learning deficit was first introduced into the educational and psychological literature. So we know that the relationship between these two, they've been there for a very long time. They've essentially been holding hands for quite a while, and we see them co-occur many, many times. Now let's shift a little bit. We've been talking a lot about learning deficits and learning disabilities. I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by anxiety. Now, fear is the most primal instinct when we start to think about how we react to our world. Fear is essentially this emotional response that occurs in relation to an obvious, identifiable threat. I see a snake. I am afraid. I am afraid because the snake could hurt me. I know it could hurt me. I know it could kill me. It could bite me. And so I am afraid of that. I want to get away from it. Now, panic is something a little bit different. We talk about panic attacks quite frequently, and we know that a kind of anxiety disorder is panic disorder. And what panic is this sudden subjective sense. So you experience it as a person. There's not one particular thing in your environment. There's no snake, there's no nothing. This subjective feeling of doom that is accompanied by what we call a massive autonomic surge. What does that mean? That's just our fancy way of saying fight or flight. So it's not just emotional. We have a physical response to it. Our pulse quickens, our digestive system starts to shut down, our adrenaline spikes, we are able to run faster, be able to lift more weight, all of these things that we need to get ourselves out of a potentially dangerous situation. Now, the problem is that sometimes when we have these panic attacks, we're not in a dangerous situation. We're not out in the jungle. We're not being pursued by anything particularly frightening. We might just be sitting in the middle of English class as a sophomore, and suddenly we break out in a cold sweat, and our heart starts to beat, and our eyes start to feel like they're narrowing, and it's very frightening, because this is when the panic just occurs in response to a stimulus in our environment that we can't identify. There's no identifiable trigger, which is part of what makes it so frightening because it's so sudden. Now, finally, we get to anxiety. And anxiety, I always think about it as the dark cloud. It just follows you around. It's this lingering sense of upset, of unease that doesn't have a direct cause. A lot of times it just comes up out of nowhere. And in some instances, because our brains are wired to make sense of these experiences, we ascribe the feeling that we get, this just sudden onset of, ooh, I don't feel so good about this. This is really uncomfortable. I'm feeling a little nervous. Well, why am I feeling that way? Oh, it must be whatever you'd like to insert here. It's because that person walked into the room and I feel like they might be laughing at me. Our brain tries to find patterns to help to explain what we're feeling, especially when it's something that doesn't make a lot of sense. So we can definitely see what's going on for a lot of these individuals where we can be afraid or have anxiety about something that just by itself isn't scary. By itself, a snake, that can be scary because it's dangerous. By itself, a math test isn't scary. Now, I also think it's important to talk about the experience of fear conditioning. Now, again, this is essentially what we refer to as psychologists, how we make this initial connection between whatever this feared item or stimulus is, whether it's a math test, whether it's a dog, whether it's the night, anything like that. We make this connection between something that on its own should not inspire fear or anxiety. We learn to fear something. Now, there's also a secondary process that's called generalization. What that means is that we may start out by feeling a little nervous about one thing, but anxiety is insidious. I always think about it as a greedy emotion. It wants more and more of our attention. And the way that it does that is that it makes us afraid of more and more things. So I'm going to go back to the first example of being in the math class. Well, so now maybe since I was nervous and upset because I couldn't do the math problem at the board, I avoid being called up to the board altogether. Maybe that starts to generalize or spread out to me being afraid of answering any questions in math class. That could then generalize to me being afraid of doing any math-related work. Now, you can see that as the fear grows, as it spreads, this leads to far greater impairments because it restricts what we're willing to do. It starts from, I don't want to go up to the board, to, I don't want to go to math class at all. And that is where we see a huge issue, because if we don't stop the spread, it can happen very quickly, and it can be harder to dismantle this kind of a fear as we move forward. Now, when we talk about the process of test or academic related anxiety, essentially what we mean by this process is that there have to be multiple negative experiences that a child has with a given subject or with learning in general that leads them to develop this kind of anxiety that could result in something like school avoidance, or refusing to participate in class, or trying to avoid academic related tasks altogether. And if we think about how this can slowly generalize, you can see a child who initially struggles in one domain can slowly become less and less engaged in learning more generally, because they're not getting the assistance that they need, and they start to see themselves as less competent and as less able to engage in this kind of behavior as they get a little bit older. Now, one of the things that I like to address here is essentially the relationship between all of these variables. Again, we initially will start out with something like a student's asked to read in class. The child struggles to read. Now the reason that I always like to say the child struggles to read is that it's not just a child who has a documented learning disability. This could be a child who has subtle weaknesses. And again, the weaknesses could be driven by anxiety. It could be driven by a learning issue. It could just be a relative difficulty for this child. It could be all three. But they have a negative experience, and then they have this emotional component, which we're going to call right now embarrassment. And over time, it produces the effect of being anxious, being reluctant to read in class, being reluctant to engage in this one behavior. So we can move on from this one. Excellent. So let's talk a little bit more extensively about test anxiety, because this is something that a lot of students, especially my high school students, will come and talk to me about, because what we know is that they're preparing for something like the SAT. A lot of their achievement and a lot of their academic prowess is really built on testing in and of itself. And the nature of many of these assessments really starts to drive a student's anxiety. We're going to talk a little bit later about the kind of goals that motivate achievement more generally. That'll help to elucidate this. But just from this perspective, when we talk about test anxiety, this is where we have this intense and excessive fear that's related to any performance environment. The model that's presented for these kinds of concerns in the three core domains that are related to test anxiety is very similar to the cognitive behavioral model that is generally used in psychology to talk about anxiety. Essentially, this model emphasizes that there is a relationship between our thoughts, so how we look at a situation, how we initially perceive things, how we understand ourselves, our emotion about that situation in and of itself, and finally, the behavior that we exhibit in any given environment and how that behavior impacts us and impacts how others relate to us. So within the context of this, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral model, we have three things that contribute to test-related anxiety. We have the cognitive or thought-based portion, which is referred to as worry. So these are essentially these negative thoughts that a child will have when approaching a test. I'm never going to pass this. I'm too stupid. There's no way. I'm terrible in math. I've never been able to read. I'm not going to be able to finish the test. All of these initial thoughts that we have even before we enter into the testing room itself. Then we have the emotional part. So this is not just the subjective feeling, our personal feelings of nervousness, anxiety, dread, any of these other pieces, but also it encompasses the biological responses to that. Because when we feel anxious, our body behaves in a particular way. Our palms could sweat, our stomach starts to hurt, we can get tension headaches. There are all of these body-based responses to emotional concerns that are important to recognize and can also be signs of stress. And then finally, we have the behavior. And the behavior could take the form of something like avoidance, so a child who tries just to get out of the test, or it could be off-task behavior, distracting others, looking around the room, refusing to engage in the test itself. The combination of these three explains how a child understands the test, the environment, how they respond to it emotionally and physiologically, and how they behave when they know that they're going to be tested. Now, I had mentioned a minute ago goals and our motivations. Now, the term that we tend to use to refer to these variables is what's called approach goals. Essentially, what is motivating you to study for this test? What is motivating you to do well? And we think about several different reasons that we are motivated. The first one is what's called mastery learning. You are motivated to do something because you want to become a master in it. So for example, when I was studying for my Ph.D., I was motivated by the fact that I wanted to be a psychologist. I wanted to better understand human behavior. I loved the subject in and of itself. So at a certain point, grades really didn't mean as much to me. I needed to know that when I walked out of that classroom, I knew how to write a certain kind of a report. I knew how to administer a kind of an assessment, things like that. Now, the other side of that coin is what we think of as performance goals. This essentially refers to when we just want to pass the test. We don't care how we pass the test. We want to just get through it. If you've ever had a test where you've just crammed for, but you didn't care if the day after the test you could remember any of it, that's a performance-related goals. And what we know is that for many individuals who have test anxiety, they have a very dysfunctional view of how competent they are, and that impacts the motivation they have for doing well. They tend to focus more on these performance goals, meaning that they just want to get through the test. If 2 weeks later they have no idea how the voting system in the United States works, they don't care. They got an A on the test, and that's all that matters. These are the kids who can a lot of times use very inefficient study strategies rather than trying to link new material to what they've learned previously, make associations between new information so that they can have a deeper and more efficient way of learning and remembering new information. Now, the other part of this that's extremely important when we think about in terms of anxiety is that for many of these individuals, they are highly motivated by a fear of failing. It's usually less the fact that they want to be perfect, they just don't want to fail. And what that says to me is that the perception that other people have of you is more important than how you're really doing. So this could be a child who everything has to be a perfect A and they'll get that A no matter what. This could also take the form of a child who refuses to try something because they want to save face. They'd rather not try than try it and risk the fact that they may be proven to be not as good as they thought they were. The kid who, for lack of a better phrase, is too cool for school. I don't feel like trying, but if I tried, I could knock this out of the park. But they never actually put the effort forth. You can see what we're talking about here. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about how this can really come into play when we're thinking about how a child walks into a given environment to be tested, what I refer to as something like a performance-based environment. What we know is that there are three main factors that generally add up to this. A student's perceptions of the test, not just how difficult it is, but what the test means for them. Their perceptions of themselves, how competent are they? Did they study enough? Are they good in this subject? And finally, the perceptions of the situation. So when we talk about these factors, what we know is that many times children who have test anxiety, they will view any kind of performance domain, any kind of testing or evaluation as threatening to themselves. They see this as a threat to their self-concept because they have so ingrained it that achievement, getting an A, is so important that not hitting that goal means that everything else that they think about themselves is wrong, is inaccurate. It shakes their foundation. Now, the same thing about how they perceive themselves. If you're walking in and already feel like, oh, well, I've never been able to do math, I guarantee you that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And finally, the perceptions of the situation. Now, this is important because we know that certain kinds of tests can have certain meanings for children. Let's think of the example of a child who is taking 1 of 10 quizzes that they know they're going to be getting throughout the semester, and the teacher says, I'll drop the lowest grade. Now that might seem like a really basic example, but for that child, maybe not doing that well on that one quiz isn't so important because they know, I have a chance to do better later. However, a child who knows this is my final exam and it counts for 70% of my grade, that situation has a very different impact on how the child views the test and how they may respond to that demand. Now, there's also a lot of research that's been done on subject-specific anxiety. Now, math anxiety is something that I see very, very frequently. Now, what we know is that studies have provided evidence for an organic basis, a brain-based basis for this kind of experience. Essentially, that we know that there is a true physiological bodily response to this level of anxiety. And not only do we have this physiological response, but that this kind of stress genuinely interferes with the quality of an individual's number manipulation and problem-solving skills. And that may seem very unusual. It's sort of like if you know it, Why can't you just do it? And that's a question I get a lot of times from parents. They know it when I'm sitting with them. They know it when I'm doing flashcards, but the minute they sit down for that test, it's gone. We might as well never have gone over it ever. And what a lot of times I'll say to them is that when we're thinking of something like math, we're using a lot of different cognitive processes. One in particular called their working memory. Now, our working memory shortly is essentially a little sketch pad, a little tool that we use in our brain that when we're doing something like math, think of it like a little sketchbook. I take it out, I write down the numbers that I have to add, subtract, or multiply, and I quickly do the calculation in my head. If I'm anxious, however, what happens is that the sketch pad becomes harder to read. Essentially, we know that anxiety has a really negative effect on a lot of these cognitive functions, and working memory is one of the ones that tends to be impacted the most. So it's actually not surprising that we see genuine differences in the performance levels in these individuals. And essentially what it means is that we're less efficient. It requires far more effort than usual to perform this task, despite our level of knowledge. Now, similarly, when we talk about reading anxiety, and very similar for math anxiety, is that this is something that is learned over time, multiple negative experiences. And what's interesting is that research on reading anxiety in particular has actually found that the centers of the brain that are activated when individuals report having anxiety related to reading are the same centers that are activated in anticipation of bodily pain or stress. So if you know you have to go in and get a root canal, there's a particular part of your brain that becomes activated, and it is the same part of your brain that if you experience reading anxiety, you will start to activate when you're nervous about having to read out loud in class. Now, if we think about, again, this discussion of fear conditioning, we can see how over time this can become increasingly difficult for an individual to manage. Now, the other behavior I really think is important to talk about is avoidance. Because avoidance, which I also think of in the same domain as procrastination, it's particularly maladaptive for two reasons. First off, avoidance allows us to maintain anxiety. The saying, face your fears, is very accurate. The only way to reduce anxiety is to face the anxiety-producing stimulus with therapeutic support. So something like a breathing exercise or having someone with you to slowly calm yourself, to show yourself that the stimulus we've been so afraid of really isn't so scary at all. Avoidance, however, allows the anxiety to grow and spread, like I was talking about before, with generalization. Now, when we think about learning, the other reason that avoidance is particularly problematic is because it also then reduces our exposure to appropriate instruction. The child who's nervous about reading out loud in class, the more he avoids it, the less exposure and practice he gets. And if he truly has an underlying reading deficit, that's going to exacerbate any weaknesses that are there, even those which are very, very subtle. The other thing that's important to note here is that avoidance itself, or procrastination itself, tends to become very reinforcing for a child. Just the act of avoidance is something that we will continue to seek out, and it's typically not something that children are highly aware of. I'm going to illustrate it here. So we have the example of a child who is anxious to read out loud in class. The child acts out, whether calling out, making fun of a classmate, something that disrupts instruction. The child is sent to the principal's office, so they don't have to read out loud in class, and perhaps, depending on how far the principal's office is, maybe they miss out on reading class altogether. The child continues to avoid reading, and as part of that avoidance, they start to feel better. If you've ever had plans that you've made with someone and they cancel at the last minute because you didn't really want to see them, you're like, oh, this is the best, this is the most amazing feeling. And if you're saying that you've never felt that, I don't know how to relate to you. But all humor aside, we know that when we are able to get away from something we really don't want to do, we feel good. So many times we will continue to seek out that emotion, and the avoidance cycle itself becomes reinforcing to us. Now, I talked a little bit about before the kind of brain-based research that we've seen that says that there are definitely differences in the brains of individuals who have anxiety and learning disabilities from individuals in the general population. Now, I know that it's late in the evening, and so I'm not going to, really go too in depth in this. But one of the things that I think is really important is essentially, first off, that this is very real for the individual. Many parents will say to me, are they just trying to get out of it? Essentially, are they trying to be lazy? And my answer is no. Most kids are motivated to do well. They've learned that they're either not competent enough, that they really don't know what they're doing, or they have become so overwhelmed and anxious that they just aren't able to access that skill. They're not able to engage in learning with us. And this is why this is so important, is that it's something that is occurring at an organic level. And we also know that, again, when we talk about the areas of the brain that are activated, they're the same things that are related to our pain receptors, our experience of pain and anticipation of pain. So we know that it's something that is truly uncomfortable psychologically for the individual that we're talking about. Now, I want to talk more generally about how does anxiety impact just our cognitive processing? How does it impact our thinking skills more generally? And there's a couple different ways to look at this. The first one is that essentially that there's an impact of anxiety depending on how complex the task is. Essentially, that anxiety has a negative effect on our thinking and cognitive processing more generally. It gums up the gears, if you will. It takes up too much space in our working memory. It reduces our attention. If you think about the idea of you're sitting on a plane, the plane hits turbulence. Maybe it's not so bad that you're really scared, but it's enough to jostle you. Maybe the little air filters come down from the ceiling. And then as this is all happening, the stewardess walks past you and plops an algebra test in front of you and tells you to get started. You are not going to have the emotional bandwidth to engage in that test, even if you're someone who knows algebra inside out, upside down, and sideways. That's what I'm talking about here. Essentially, it gums up the gears and we're not able to be as efficient as we want. We can't demonstrate our potential. Now, essentially, the anxiety complexity relationship I talked about before is that the more difficult the problem, the greater the impact of anxiety. So if it's something that we can do essentially with our eyes closed, even if we're anxious, we're going to be able to do it. We can walk and be anxious at the same time. Can I be anxious and perform a complex statistical analysis on something? Probably not. Now, there's another model that talks a little bit about this, that talks about the cognitive interference model, essentially focusing on how it impacts our intelligence more generally. And it's very similar to how we see it in terms of the cognitive processing. Again, the greater the anxiety, what many researchers have said is that the poorer our cognitive ability. The more anxious we are, the less able we are to demonstrate our potential. And one of the things that's come out in more recent research is that many individuals, when they're under anxiety or under stress, they're not able to engage in what we think of as metacognitive strategies. Essentially, what I'm saying here is that they're not using the most efficient strategies to organize their thoughts, to approach tasks, to complete things that they have to do. They're just so overwhelmed. The system itself has very limited resources. So if you overwhelm the system, it's not going to work as well. And that's essentially what we're seeing here. Now, there's another view on this, however, and that essentially says that there is some kind of motivational, adaptive improvement that we can see because of anxiety. If we think of anxiety at its basis level, or any emotion for that matter, emotions simply tell us what we care about in our environment. If you care about something, you're going to be anxious to do it. If you don't care about something, you're not going to pay a lot of attention to it. Now, that may sound simple, but think about something like a mundane daily task, paying your bills. If you don't really see why paying your bills is all that important, I guarantee you that you're going to have a really bad credit score. Same thing here. If a child doesn't really care about the test, if they feel it's not meaningful for them, they're not going to study for it at all. So they're not going to put any effort towards it. So when we think about how to best understand the fact that we see this kind of polar relationship between these two theories, the best way to understand it is that there is an optimal level of anxiety, and that optimal level has been designated by what's called the YatesDodson Law. Essentially, the takeaway from this is that there is a particular point at which the height of our anxiety can improve our performance. Too little anxiety, we don't care and maybe we don't do anything. But on the other end of that, if the anxiety is too great, it will interfere with our ability to be efficient and to do our best. So what we have to do is understand, well, what are some of the factors that can help us to identify that optimal level of anxiety? And what many researchers in education have talked about is that a student's self-concept. So what I had talked about at the beginning of the presentation about how a student perceives themselves and their abilities, that has a very particular effect on how anxiety contributes to their performance. And what we see again is that for the students who feel that they're less competent, the students who feel like they're not going to do well on something, and the students who are more motivated by a fear of failure, we see that the greater the anxiety, the less likely the student is going to be able to perform well. This is where we see anxiety as something that's very, very detrimental to general functioning. And what's interesting is that we actually see a difference between men and women when we study this relationship. Women who feel that they are less competent in a particular subject and who are highly motivated by a fear of failure, when they experience a tremendous amount of anxiety, they tend to be more distractible. They're less likely to engage in on-task behavior. So maybe they'll sit down to start the writing assignment that they've been putting off for a long time, and oh, maybe I'll just check my email for 5 minutes, or oh, let me just get myself up and get a snack, or oh, I'm just going to take a 5-minute break, and 3 hours later they realize that they never got something done. So again, there are definitely a lot of individual aspects that can contribute to how anxiety impacts achievement and whether it's something that is beneficial or something detrimental. Again, we see a similar pattern here when we look at actual achievement levels. Essentially, students who were studied who had low achievement levels, these were individuals who had underlying learning difficulties. The more anxiety that they felt, the more that they tried hard, they tried to get through it, the more motivated they were. Students in higher achieving groups, essentially the more anxiety they felt, the worse they performed. So it's not just the goal or the motivator that you have, it's not just potentially your gender, it's not just your level of ability, but it can also be how you're interpreting the things around you and what a lot of these testing situations mean for you. Now, I always like to talk a little bit about what a neuropsychologist is and essentially what we can add to these kinds of situations. Essentially, a neuropsychologist functions as someone who looks at brain behavior relationships. We want to understand where an individual is functioning across multiple domains, including general IQ, language skills, visual, spatial, and motor functions, attention and executive control, general memory, academic functioning and achievement, as well as social, emotional, and interpersonal skills. And the way that we measure that is we administer a lot of paper and pencil and computerized measures, and we also look at a student in a very holistic way. We gather information from teachers, from parents, from therapists, from the child themselves, and we put all this information together to better understand what may be presenting as a barrier to an individual's success. So when students come into me and we're trying to make a determination about whether they have a learning disability, I often have to parse out what are the factors that is interfering with a child's ability to succeed. Is it that there is an underlying deficit in this academic domain? Is it a function of attentional weaknesses? Is it a function of anxiety? Is it a function of motivation? Is it a combination of all of these other things or something else entirely? That's essentially where we come in. We're modern day cognitive detectives. That's how I always like to think about it. Now, I've talked a lot about all of these things that can go wrong for these children, but I think it's also important to talk about what can go right, what can protect students, and what can we do to support them when we identify them. And there are a couple very basic strategies that I think we can give as broad strokes to help these students to do their best. The first is a self-advocacy strategy. Ensure that students feel comfortable coming to their teachers and talking about where they have deficits. Many students don't want to be seen as someone who is stupid or the only person who has a question about something. Make sure that the classroom environment is conducive to questions, that it's something that is encouraged, whether it's raising your hand in the middle of the class or whether it's one-on-one instruction, maybe a little bit afterwards or before class starts. In addition, it's important to remember that there's a fine line between providing assistance when necessary and having a student over rely on teachers or parents. And this is something that occurs at an individual level. It's hard to talk about in these broader dimensions because so many kids are so different in how they receive support and how they take in feedback. Many parents express to me that they're overly concerned that the child may not learn to be competent on their own. They'll never be confident in the skill. And it's a balancing act between making sure that we're providing and meeting a student where they are and giving them the coping skills to be able to manage some of these emotional concerns, as well as recognizing the points where we say, I know that you're able to do it, just try, or just, try it on your own and then ask for my assistance. Any of these strategies that can work for any individual child. In addition, identifying strengths. As adults, we're always able to play to our strengths, whether at work, at school. When we choose a profession, we choose something that we tend to be good at and that we genuinely try to enjoy anytime that we can. And for kids, they're less able to do that. So they have a long period of time where we may be harping on areas of weakness for them over and over and over again. And given that they spend the majority of their time in school, for a child that has true learning issues and anxiety, that's a very long period of time that you're spending being in distress. So anytime that we can use strategies that emphasize skills to ameliorate areas of weakness, I think is very important. One of the examples I like to give, because it's something that worked for me, is being able to use verbal techniques to walk through something like a math problem. Rather than just writing out the numbers, when I was learning how to do something like long division or regrouping, I would actually write verbatim what the teacher was saying because that was my strength. And I used it to help encode or remember the information in a more meaningful way. And finally, it's very important to have something like social connections. We know that children who have significant learning issues and who have this anxiety, they're at a greater risk for developing less fulfilling or less meaningful social reactions to other students. They're at a greater risk for things like bullying, and they tend to report less friendships. And many times this is because they are less, open to interacting with others, and sometimes they can have their difficulties put on display for anyone in the classroom, which can be very, very difficult for a lot of kids. The more supports that we can build up and help children to remember that they are not the only ones who have this kind of an issue, the more that we can build success stories. Talking about your own experiences. We know that learning difficulties tend to run in families. So a lot of times if I have a particularly successful parent who also has had a lot of learning issues, I make sure to say to them, talk to your child about this. Say, I know this is hard for you. It's something that I did. It's something that I went through, but look at where I am now. Or looking up celebrities the child likes or admires who have also had a lot of issues and talking about how they've been successful regardless, I think is, again, very, very important for self-esteem and confidence. We also know that helping children to have these emotional regulation skills, this is something that can be attained by working with an individual therapist. Again, when we talk about anxiety, we usually want to build a child's ability to tolerate this kind of frustration or upset through calming techniques. Being able to ask for a very time-limited break that does not encourage avoidance, but allows a child to have a moment to reset or compose themselves when they feel that they're getting overwhelmed or upset, ensuring that we show them that it is possible for them to regulate themselves. Because what we know is that when we've looked at studies with children who have math anxiety, When they were taught emotional regulation skills, they're better able to use these strategies and compensate for their areas of weakness. And finally, really, these are the core things that I think about: validation, accurate praise, constructive criticism, and recognition of maladaptive patterns. When a child says it is having difficulty, it's okay to say, you're right, today is not a great day. You're not having a great day. A lot of times we want to be overly positive, but sometimes a child just wants someone to acknowledge that they're having a difficulty. It's not saying, oh yeah, you're terrible in math. It's saying, I know this is hard today. You're right. How infuriating is it to have someone who is only positive or says, just look on the bright side? That can only go so far when you're truly having a difficulty. When we provide specific labeled praise, something like, instead of saying good job, we say, I like how you worked through all 5 problems on the sheet and you didn't ask for any kind of help today. Or I noticed that you were able to do 3 more problems today than you did yesterday. That's amazing. Showing the child what they're being encouraged to do to increase the likelihood that they'll use that behavior. Having constructive criticism that's clear but supportive. This is something important. When I was up at that blackboard, one of the reasons that I remember it so clearly is because as I passed the teacher, she went, oh God, I can't believe that you weren't able to do that. I will never forget that. That stays with me to this day. Her tone, the phrase itself, and it colored my view of math for a very long time. If you're going to provide criticism, make sure that it's useful. And finally, recognizing when some of the things may be encouraging a child to avoid a particular situation or behavior. Because what we want to do is meet children where they are, but make sure that they're using strategies and moving forward, not trying to engage in the same behaviors that they have been holding them back. So I have a list of references and resources for anyone who's interested. And if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer as many as I can. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to hearing from you about what I can help to clarify.
All right, well done. And I can see we've gone a little over, so I'm going to get right into some questions, okay?
Sounds good.
All right. I have actually 2 questions having to do with perfectionism.
Mhm.
One of them is, what can I do to support a child who's a perfectionist? My child is unable to do well academically, but the time and effort, my child is able to do things well academically, but it takes so much, he has no time for anything else. So can you talk about that a little bit and what might be helpful for that kid?
Absolutely. It's a really great question. It's something that I see a lot in my clinical practice. Many times we have this double-edged sword of perfectionism where a child is really either won't turn something in until they deem it perfect, or they're able to achieve, but the strategies that they use are so inefficient that they literally have almost time for nothing else. And it becomes a significant burden at home. And in many instances, this is where working with a professional to help to develop these tolerance strategies can be extremely helpful. Helping a child recognize that nothing has to be perfect, and that perfect is a concept that doesn't exist, and helping to see where exactly the anxiety is stemming from and what can be done so that they're able to perhaps only work for a certain period of time. One of the strategies I used for a client in this domain was we set a curfew, and when she hit that certain time, she was not going to work on any more assignments. And her teachers agreed to lighten her workload temporarily as she was going through therapy and accept what she was able to finish. And what we saw is that we saw a reduction in not only her perfectionism, but we saw slowly with some deep breathing exercises and meditation, a reduction in her anxiety more generally. And slowly she was able to retransition back to this intensive workload and then successfully transition into college.
Okay, so along that same line about this whole perfectionist thing, there seems to be the impression that when someone is perceived as a perfectionist, the implication is that they have OCD. And myself personally, I have heard that expression, they talk about someone doing something so carefully, and it's like, oh, well, that's their OCD. So in minds, I think it gets compressed. And I'd like you just to talk about that a little bit, because being a perfectionist doesn't mean that you have something that's diagnosable as OCD.
You're absolutely right. And I'm really glad that you bring this up, because it is something that has become synonymous with OCD. And I think we use the term OCD very loosely in common, conversation, without having a full understanding of what exactly it means to have something like OCD. Really, what we know is that perfectionism is an extension of anxiety. And it's far more complex just in and of itself, where a child can just experience this because they're so driven to do well. Typically, individuals who have obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, the behaviors that they engage in are meant to undo or are a reaction to intrusive anxiety producing thoughts. They're meant to make a child feel better. Whereas the perfectionism that we see is something that's tied to anxiety far more generally. And it's essentially an expression of, this must be exactly how I want it to be, otherwise I don't feel like I'm going to be successful. So I'm glad you bring it up, because it's absolutely something that we see very, very frequently. And it's handled in a manner that's far more similar to general intense anxiety rather than our OCD protocols.
Yeah, and it seems very unfair to make that distinction without,
Absolutely.
Without any understanding of what either one of them really means.
I completely agree with you. I'm glad you bring it up.
Okay. This is with regard to an 11-year-old student who is easily upset and anxious. And you touched on this a little bit, but there's a request for some discrete, quick techniques to help calm the individual. So could you just, throw out some ideas there that might be helpful?
That's a great question. And a lot of times when we have individuals like this, I'd like to do one of two things. Part of it is we want to help the child to recognize early signs of this dysregulation or this upset coming on. So if they start to feel that they can either walk up to the teacher or raise their hand or potentially just ask, I need a quick break, a minute, brain break. And many times teachers are well able to give them a quick, either whether it's passing out some kind of supplies, getting up and walking out to the bathroom, or just taking a moment to take a deep breath. That's one thing, because we want a child at that age to slowly start to be able to recognize when they feel these emotions coming on and short circuit them before it gets to a point of significant upset. On the other hand, if other individuals in the environment can see that the child is getting to that point before he or she is able to tell someone, in the classroom, a lot of times I like teachers to do something like walking past their desk and perhaps tapping twice. So it's a very simple cue that a lot of kids won't pick up on. You could walk past them, gently touch their shoulder, and essentially that's the sign of, I need you to take a quick break. It's not punitive. It's not them being in trouble. It's just, I want you to take a minute. I see you're getting upset. And that's something that can be worked out with the child themselves. Other times when it's a parent who's involved, the parent will use a particular phrase. One of the phrases that we've used in the past has been something like, that's enough, or we'll do this later. Something like that, that is quick, is innocuous. No one else is going to know what it means. And it just serves as a cue of, well, you're going to stop what we're doing right now. We're all going to take a quick break and we'll come back to it at, in the next 5 minutes or 2 minutes. So a lot of times those are the kind of cues that I'll have. And it's important to have a particular time limit for that coping strategy and have a plan of what exactly do you do.
Would it work in that teacher tapping on the shoulder situation? Could it be a situation where the teacher, depending, I guess, on the ages, what kind of, class age we're talking about here, but kind of just generally call a break, and let's stand up and stretch and touch your toes, whatever. But just to
Absolutely.
break that cycle for that kid, and probably, who knows who else in the class. But it may be just time to do something, and this kid is the first one to be the canary in the coal mine.
Absolutely. I think that anything that can be class-wide is something that's very beneficial, because many times those little breaks are helpful for everyone. It's just that someone might be more obvious in needing that kind of moment than anyone else in the classroom.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about a student, and it doesn't say here how old this child is. Student seems to hold it together during the day in terms of the anxiety, but at the end of the day, just the term is breaks down at home. So I'm not quite sure, but I think this student is not unique. So I'm sure these circumstances happen. So setting some time aside, I'm guessing, or not, not launching right into homework, but doing something else to kind of have a cool down period would be appropriate.
Absolutely. A lot of times I tell parents, we as adults a lot of times have a built-in decompression period if we have a commute. So I have a 30-minute drive to my office. I have that 30 minutes by myself in my car to do whatever I have to do to get myself in a better mood, whether it's listening to a particular song or just, being lost in my own thoughts or whatever. And then by the time I get home, I'm able to work through whatever's going on in my head. And I'm usually in a different mood than I left the office in. But for children, they don't always have that luxury. And I think a lot of times it's a balance between having a very structured break period of, say you get home at 3:30. Well, you can do an activity of your choice until 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock means it's time to get up, go and start your homework, but having that time to do something that they enjoy. Now, the key here, though, is that it shouldn't be something that they have a particular difficulty transitioning from. So some parents will tell me, yes, they love to play video games, but if I try to get them off the video games, it becomes a huge fight. That would be an instance where I'd say there has to be a different activity that's there that's definitely pleasurable, but that the child is better able to transition from. And it should be time limited. A lot of times I'll say use a kitchen timer. The child, depending on their age, can come in, set the timer. When the timer goes off, parent doesn't have to remind, child gets up and starts homework. Something like that where they're allowed to do it, they can get their energy out in a positive way, and then transition back to getting some homework done.
Okay, good idea. I have a question about homework, and it says, how does homework during the springtime create so much anxiety? And so there's no real explanation here in terms of what ages we're talking about or anything. I don't know, does more anxiety exist in the spring because it's the end of the year approaching?
It's an interesting question. I mean, anecdotally, it's very, very possible. It's not something that I know off the top of my head of a particular research in this kind of domain. Well, it could be that sometimes children, because they are getting to the end of the year, sometimes we know that springtime can also correspond with park testing or other standardized measures. And it also is approaching a point of transition that in and of itself can bring a lot of anxiety for kids. And I think also, looking outside, seeing how beautiful it is, wanting it to be summertime and saying, what do you mean I have to do 20 more math problems when I get home? We can see kind of the mixture of any of those variables all coming together to create some anxiety.
I just got a confirmation. This child in question about this springtime thing happens to be 13. So I'm saying middle school. And, it's hard to do when you come home in the spring and the weather's nice.
Absolutely. I mean, let's face it, most of us don't come home with work that we do after we leave the office. I mean, some of us do. I'm guilty of it, but many times we are able to say, no, I'm not going to do it, or I'm going to go in a little bit early tomorrow. Whereas for kids, we have this mandated practice that's there. And if you're already a child who has learning issues, it's like, I've done 6 to 8 hours of this. Why am I doing more? And it's a question that, a lot of people have strong opinions on, but I think that understanding that any of us would be overwhelmed and tired by that point, children are no different, and they're going to have the same reactions that we might.
Okay, we've gone well over, but I'm going to have one more question. Okay,
Okay.
you
Nope.
you talked about avoidance and procrastination.
Mhm.
The general question is, what comes first? Does procrastination start and lead to avoidance? I mean, is there a kind of a hierarchy there? So if you've got a child that's turning into a procrastinator, would that be something you needed to be worried about as avoidance could follow?
It's a good question, and honestly, there's no direct hierarchy there. They tend to correlate because essentially procrastination is avoidance. I'll put it off. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. So usually what you see is that a child will avoid some way or another. The procrastination itself, the only difference there that makes it a little bit unique is that it also involves a misperception of time. Kids who are true procrastinators really don't have a good grasp on how long it genuinely takes them to complete a given task and how much time they have available to them. Whereas other kids who are more avoidant and purely avoidant, they may know absolutely how long it takes for them to do something like that and how much time is available. They just don't want to do it. So they're related, they're overlapping categories, and I think generally that's why we'll see them co-occurring. But certainly if you start to see that pattern of behavior, it's something that you want to try to gently intervene with so that a child doesn't get into the habit of engaging in that. And sometimes it's also recognizing the habits that we have, because certainly children live with, learn what they live. And that's something that we should also be aware of. And again, very guilty of that myself. So it's something I have to be aware of also.
I don't think I ever quite understood that procrastination versus not understanding how much time it would take to do something, whereas avoidance is just exactly that, just wanting to avoid it. I guess we're all guilty of both at one time or another.
Absolutely.
All right. I think we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you very much, Dr. Murphy. That was a great presentation.
My pleasure.
I'm going to turn this back over to Kelly for her to do her wrap up. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you for joining our webinar on Insight to the Anxious Learner, Research and Intervention. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The webinar blog is open now and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website. For any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to our site. Our next presentation, Freedom from Panic, Learn to Identify and Manage Panic and Anxiety in Adults, it will be presented by Rachel Stroll and is scheduled for June 26, 2019. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Murphy, for your presentation, and thank you, everyone, for attending. Good night.